Good day everyone, I am Kent Nevesis and my report entitled Novation. Novation concept. It is the modification or extinguishment of an obligation by another, either by changing the object or principal condition, substituting the person of the debtor, or subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. Example, DOC 10,000. If the parties later agree that D should give instead a ring to C, there is an novation by changing the object of prestation. Ibig sabihin daw dito, instead na pera yung ibayad ni C, ni D, kay meron siyang utang kay C na 10,000, ang substitute niya lang na binayad ay ang object, which is ang ring na lang pang yung binayad niya. So, there is a novation in that scenario. Number 2. If the parties agree with D shall take the place of D as the new debtor, there is a novation by substituting the person of the debtor. Dito naman ay si T. He wants to take the place of the debtor naman dito. Gusto niya maging debtor. Tsaka, matatawag siya na novation kasi there is a substitution between the person of the debtor. Ibig sabihin, hindi na si D yung debtor dito, kundi si T. Tapos number 3 case, if the parties later agree that X shall take the place of C as the new creditor, there is innovation by subrogating the third person of the rights of the creditor. Dito naman, nag-take na yung new na creditor. Diba si C yung creditor, then X wants to be a new creditor. There is a consent in C na maging si X na yung creditor, so there is a novation by subrogating a third person in the rights of the creditor. Dito naman tayo sa requisites of novation. Paano ba siya matatawag ng novation? Number 1, there must be a previous valid obligation. For example, dapat daw mayroong previous na valid obligation. For example, dati may utang si D kay C na 10,000. That is a previous obligation. So ngayon, gusto ni D na wala siyang pera, pero gusto niya magbayad. Kaya yung singsing na lang yung binayad niya. So, C agrees. Yan matatawag na novation. There is a previous valid obligation. Number 2, there must be an agreement between the parties to modify or extinguish the obligation, except for the following daw. A. When the person of the debtor is changed, which can be made even if it is against the will of the debtor. Dito naman, when the debtor wants to be a debtor, but there is no consent with the true debtor, it can be not a novation. Para matawag siya ng novation, kailangan ng consent. B. When another person is subrogated in the place of the creditor. For example, sa number 1, when a creditor pays another creditor who is preferred even without the debtor's knowledge. Ibig sabihin dito, si creditor, may ibang creditor na nagbayad sa kanila, pero hindi alam ni debtor. So, mag-complain yun si debtor. Kaya matatawag siya na hindi siya maging novation, ma-invalid siya kasi walang consent galing sa debtor na meron nang bumayad kay na creditor na magiging bagong creditor niya. Number 2, when even without the knowledge of the debtor, a person invested in the fulfillment of the obligation pays without prejudice to the new effects of confusion of the latter's share. So, dito naman tayo sa kinds of novation. Kinds of novation according to the object of our purpose. A. Real or object. Novation by changing the object or principal condition. Dito sa real objects, ito yung kind na novation. Yung example kanina na object yung change. For example kanina, DOC 10,000. So, si D, wala siyang cash. So, he he lent an alternative object to pay his debt 10,000, which is ring, yung ring. Yung ring yung binayad niya instead of money, instead of cash. Matatawag yun na real or objective na kind of novation. Sa B, personal or subjective. Novation by change of the parties, debtor man or creditor. Dito naman yung example kanina na gusto ni T na magiging bagong debtor, na mag-exchange siya na magiging bagong debtor kay kay D. Tapos yung kay X naman na gusto niya maging bagong creditor, na mag-change siya kay C kanina. Number 1, substituting the persons of the debtor. Always with the creditor consent. Dito naman, substituting the person of the debtor. Always with the creditor's consent. Ibig sabihin, substituting a person of debtor daw. Pero, always with the creditor's consent. Pero ang consent, para kay creditor, kung papayag ba siya na merong novation na manggagaling sa mga debtors. So, A, expromission. Here, a third person initiates the substitution and assumes the obligation even without the knowledge or against the will of the debtor. So, dito, merong third person na na-involved. And then, yung obligation so, sa expromission, here is a third person involved. So, there is a new debtor and the original debtor. So, the new debtor assumes that he has the right to do the obligation of the original creditor without any consent of the original creditor. So, he pays the obligation that the obligation must have obtained by the original debtor. He pays the obligation of the original debtor dito without the consent of the original debtor. So, the rights of the new debtor if he makes payment. If the substitution was without the knowledge or against the will of the original of the debtor, the new debtor can only recover insofar as the payment has been beneficial to the debtor. So, dito, if the new debtor pay the obligation of the original debtor without any consent of the original debtor, he can insofar refund the payment that he had paid to the creditor naman. So the effect, if new debtor is insolvent or does not fulfill obligation, dito daw hindi daw na-fulfill ng obligation yung new debtor. The new debtor, insolvency or non-fulfillment of the obligation shall not give rise to any liability on the part of the original debtor. So, dito, if engaged na po kayo sa novation dalawang debtor, new debtor, original debtor, so, if you are the new debtor that you are insolvency, not fulfilling your obligations, well, it would not affect the original debtor at all. So, all the burden and all the accusation is in your hand as a new debtor of that who performs that obligation. So, the original debtor is released from liability. So, walang liability yung original debtor dito. This is the true whether the substitution was without the knowledge of the debtor or against he will is consented by him. Ibig sabihin, pag walang alam ang debtor, pero pag may alam, makonsent pa rin siya. So, delegation. Here, it is the debtor who initiates the substitution, which requires the consent of all parties. All parties involve original debtors, creditors, and new debtors. So, dito, kung meron tayong expromission, meron din tayong delegation. Expromission is walang permission o walang consent yung debtor sa debtor or any other parties involved. So, dito sa delegation, meron ang consent to all other parties involved. So, rights of the new debtor if he makes payment under initial delegation. He can recover what he has paid and is entitled to subrogation. Example, he can, if meron siyang consent sa all other parties, he can recover what he has paid to the creditors under the subrogation. So, effects of new debtors in insolvent. If the new debtors is insolvent, the creditors might to proceed against the original debtors. Is not revived except when the resolvency of the new debtor was already existing and of public knowledge when the original debtors delegated his debt. Number 2, when the insolvency of the new debtor was already existing and known to be the original debtor at the time he delegated his debt. So dito naman yung mga insolvent new debtor, pwede lang sila na maging they are valid na pwede maging liable yung mga old mga original debtor if alam nila na hindi nagfulfill ng obligation yung bagong debtor na kanilang delegate nila sa mga creditor. They have an obligation if that happen. So, number 2, subrogating. A third person in the right of the creditor. Subrogation transfers the person subrogated to credit. Kanina, yung expromission tsaka delegation is sa debtor. Ngayon naman, subrogating is sa creditor. Subrogating the credit with all the rights operating thereto, either against the debtor or against third person, but the guarantors or possessors of mortgages, subject to stipulation in conventional subrogation. Kinds of subrogation. Conventional subrogation. Change the creditor by agreement of the new parties, original parties or the new creditor. Dito, the creditor may rights kung kailangan niya ba mag-change ang pagiging creditor. For example, ako creditor. And then, I decided nga na-agree ko na rin. For example, na-agree sa parties nga. So, si X na lang ang magiging creditor. So, change kami ni X. Bayadan ko ni X, then siya na ang magiging creditor sa akon ng mga debtor o sa may mga utang sa akon. So B, legal subrogation. Subrogation by operation of the law. It is presumed that there is a legal subrogation in the following cases. So, sa subrogation, meron tayong tinatawag na subrogation which is covers by law. So, sa letter C, so sa number 1, under sa delegation, meron tayong matatawag siya na sa subrogation pala. I mean, when a creditor pays, number 1, when a creditor pays another creditor who is preferred even without the debtor's knowledge. For example, itong example ko kanina, ako creditors and then si X gusto niya maging creditor, so he pays me even without the consent of the debtor, so he will be the new creditor. So 2, when a third person not interested in the obligation pays with the express of approval of the debtor. When even without the knowledge of the debtor, a person interested in the fulfillment of the obligation pays without prejudice to the effects of confusion to the latter's share. So, if we have the kind of novation na real or objective and personal or subjective, meron naman tayong tinatawag na mix of both kind of novation. Like this makes change of object and parties to the obligation. Example, D owes C 50,000. Later, the parties agrees that a ring will be used to pay the debt, with X making the payment. For example, D is the debtor, which he owes C 50,000 as C as the creditor. Then, there will be X for the mixed person or the third person or other. Then, instead of D agrees, D don't have any money to pay C 50,000, then he will be using the ring as the alternative to pay his debt, which will be agreed by other parties like a third party of X. He wants the ring to be his own object, and then he is the one who will going to pay 50,000 pesos to C. So X will be buying parang bibilhin ni X yung ring kay D para yung payment na money kay C mapupunta. There is a mixture between them. If there is a kind of novation that is according to the object or purpose, there is a kind of also novation that is according to form. First form is express. This novation declared on an equivocal term have the parties incontrovertibly disclose the other object, including other optimistically distinguishes the old one. Example, D and C entered into a contract whereby D would construct a 3-story building for C. A certain act later, however, D and C entered into a contract whereby they expressly agreed that D would not be constructing any more 3-story building on a lot but a bonus law. So, they are both agreed when they enter the contract that they are both beneficial to both each other, that they agreed so that D would not construct this is a express. Both of them agreed there is no 3-story construction under D. There is also called implied. Implied, when the old and the new obligation are on every part incomparable with each other. Specific form agrees to implement the motivator. All the present by the law would be comparable between the two contracts. Example. In the same example, D and C entered into a second contract whereby D and agreed to the construction of a bungalow on the lot, but without the parties expressly slapping and stipulating that they would no longer construct a 3-story building. Then the parties are deemed to have implicitly novated the first contract because construction of the two structures in the same lot would not be possible. So, if there is a kind of novation according to the object and purpose and according to the form, there is also a one kind of novation that is called according to the extent. So there is a total 3 of kind of novation. First one is the according to the object and purpose. The second one is the according to form. The last one is according to the extent. For the according to the extent is A. This is the kind of according to extent, total or extinctive. Here the old obligation is totally extinguished, such as when an obligation to pay a sum of money is respected with an obligation to give a diamond ring. There is a give and return. in this total extinctive. B. Partial or modificatory. Here, the old obligation still remains of force except as it have been modified, such as we have the place of payment change forever, where is the variation of the amount of the installment payments.